But the reason why MEMI is so much more efficient is because MEMI uses all of the locations in the visual field. So we move a client's eyes to the corners, we move them around in the center, and EMDR only uses horizontal eye movements at eye level.
Uh-huh.
Or sometimes they use a diagonal. The interesting thing about that is the way Shapiro described it is you move from a client's lower left to their upper right if it's diagonal, and you do this horizontally. Those two movements parallel exactly the visual accessing position of the NLP model and the auditory accessing positions of the NLP model. So, and that research was clear at the time. And there were other eye movement studies that precursed Robert Diltz's research, where it was clear that eye movements did indeed relate to sensory memories and sensory desensitization, but Shapiro never referenced them.
And let me just back you up a moment. You use the acronym MEMI, M-E-M-I?
Yes, MEMI.
And what does that stand for?
Multichannel Eye Movement Integration.
Okay. And what does multi-channel mean? What are these channels that you're referring to?
The channels are the sensory processing channels. So in my work, I've pretty much confirmed that there are three factors that are most potent in the maintenance of PTSD memories. One is physical or somatic feelings, visceral feelings. One is emotional feelings, and one is the visual imagery related to an experience.
Uh-huh.
So when we work with doing eye movements in MEMI, we're engaging all of those sensory processing areas. And EMDR, for example, does the auditory and perhaps some of the visual, but it doesn't take in the whole visual field.
Yeah. Now you make extraordinary claims, and I want to get to that.
Yeah.
because and I interviewed somebody else. I think it was an EMDR actually person who said, the cure for trauma. What different your book has got lots of case histories, and maybe you can share some of those with us here. What kinds of cases have you worked with? Are there some that are amenable, some that are not amenable to this approach? But that's the realm I want to go to now.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I've worked with just about every type of experienced trauma that you could imagine: military personnel, genocide, rape, sexual assault, child abuse. But in addition to all of those heinous areas, and the worst, of course, are genocide, rape or sexual assault, and physical atrocities from war. If you look at the research, those are the three that result in the highest percentage of PTSD cases.
Mm-hmm.
Let me think of one. So I worked with I worked with a guy who was a white collar professional, and he came to see me because his husband had come to see me the week before and said he was disappearing at night. I had never met either of them. And I right away thought that maybe the substance abuse was an issue there. But he asked me if I was willing to see the guy with, the problem. And I said I would. He came the next week, and I talked with him. He was already in therapy. And I told him that, I really couldn't work with him until he had made a decision whether he wanted to continue in therapy with the other therapists. But he eventually did finish therapy with the other person, came to see me. And in the first session, he told me about child abuse. Now I'm going to give you, I found out some of this information over time, but I'll give you all of it at one time.
Okay.
His mother was bipolar, and he had 3 siblings. His dad left the house when he was about 10 years old. Dad was an alcoholic. He had a wine bottle, smashed over his head and had to go to ER as one example by his father. But then he told me one instance where he had been sexually abused by his mother. In some graphic detail, very clear memories. And he was disappearing overnight, I found, because I think the second session, I just asked him, what are you using? You're using something. I don't know what it is. What are you using? And he said, crystal meth. I said, okay, well, we're going to have to work on that. But my take on people who are substance abusers who have experienced trauma like this is that you can and should address the trauma early in their substance abuse recovery. Otherwise, it's going to hamper their potential for success.
Sure.
So he told me about the sexual abuse, and I said, okay, well, we can do MIMI, we can do eye movement therapy on that, and help you with that. He agreed. And we only did one session on that.
Now, when you say he was disappearing at night, what does that mean?
Well, he would walk into town. We're talking about 4 or 5 miles. And he would go to the place where drugs were available. He would buy crystal meth. And, that's a drug that you basically take and you zone out for hours and hours, and you continue using. And then in the morning, when he was done using, he would go back home. But he told his husband that the reason why he disappeared was because he was depressed and over the death of his mother. She had died 3 months earlier.
Okay, so was he in some kind of a fugue state when he was going out, or was he in quotes normal addict consciousness?
Yeah, as normal as you could be in those. He was still working, maintaining his job as a white collar professional.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, it was all the drugs.
Yeah,
I'm sure he was depressed too. And that may have been the entryway to the drugs, because he didn't have a drug problem before that. So the difference would be when we did the eye movements, we were about halfway through. There are 4 sets of eye movements in MEMI. They go very fast as opposed to EMDR. When you're doing EMDR, you can do 15 or even 20 different sets of these eye movements. With this multi-channel approach, where you're engaging all of the sensory systems, it tends to go much faster. So I did 1 set with him, and I was starting on the second set, and things were starting to get a little bit better, and he just stiffened and his eyes popped, and he said, I just remembered something else. And I said, okay, what do you remember? He told me a story about being at a kitchen table where his mother was forcing him to participate in a decision to abort a baby that he had fathered at 14. And the baby's host was his mother's girlfriend. So not only, had his mother forced him to have sex with her girlfriend, but then she later on, when the girlfriend became pregnant, forced him to sit with the 2 of them and agree to an abortion. And imagine what that does to a young man.
Yeah.
So this is not unusual for people who have been sexually traumatized more than once, where you think that the worst memory, in his case, he thought the worst memory, and that's where we start. I say, what's the worst of it? And that's what we focus on. We want a particular moment in time, a problem state, as they say in NLP, that we focus on. in order to de-escalate what is below it. So when you tend to desensitize a memory at the top of the totem pole, if you will,
Yeah.
then the other memories often desensitize in an escalating kind of way.
How do you decide to move on? How do you test to see if, okay, we're okay at this level? How do you go on to the next level?
Great question.